Hello, my name is Philip Powell, and I'm going to give a lecture today on the life and legacy of Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper, God's Renaissance man from the Netherlands. Who is Abraham Kuyper? He was a theologian, a pastor, a journalist, a travelogue writer, an educator, founder of a university, politician, and statesman. He was a colossal figure in terms of the good of politics. Last year was the 100th anniversary of his death. Sadly, he is largely forgotten in the Netherlands, and to people who know him, sometimes he's openly despised. So he is a paradoxical historical figure that we want to look at today. Though more recently, there has been an increasing interest in his life and in his writings, and his works are being published again, and I've just found out that there's a new Dutch biography coming out on his life. Let me just quickly mention a couple of books that you might be interested in looking at if you want to read more about his life. There is a book here by Peter Haslam called Creating a Christian Worldview, Abraham Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism, which is a detailed study on his lectures. There is also a very good biography that you can look at called Abraham Kuyper, God's Renaissance Man, written by McGoldrick, which is from some years back. It was published in 2000, so this is a good one. And let me also say that if you want to start somewhere, you can either choose to look at Richard Mouw's book, Abraham Kuyper, A Short and Personal Introduction, or you can look at this newer book that's come out by Michael Wagenman called Engaging the World with Abraham Kuyper. These two are actually good introductions to read more about. And there's also a detailed biography about him by a guy named James Bratt called Abraham Kuyper, Modern Calvinist, Christian Democrat. So those just a little bit of information for you if you want to read more about Abraham Kuyper. But let's get into looking at Abraham Kuyper. Now, some of you may not know much about Abraham Kuyper, but you might have come across his name because in the English-speaking world, people like Francis Schaeffer have popularized Abraham Kuyper. And when you talk about Christian worldview, his name often comes up. I first came across his name in 1998 in India when I was studying on a biblical Christian worldview. I was quite astonished that there was a Christian who believed that God wanted Christians to get involved in politics, that was talking about the good of politics. That was quite new and radical for me. And if you remember that quote that he is very well known for about how there is no part of knowledge that is hermeneutically sealed off, and that over the whole universe Christ cries mine. That was the quote that I came across, and that really made me want to study about this man's life. And so I've been studying about Abraham Kuyper's life for some time now, and I want to help us get an understanding of how this man's life speaks to us today as we consider the good of politics. To understand Kuyper's life, you will need to have some background understanding. And one of the things you need to know when you think about Kuyper is Calvinism. Of course, Calvinism is connected to John Calvin, the French theologian and pastor in Geneva. And Calvinism was fundamentally about affirming the sovereignty of God over all of life. Words like predestination come up when you talk about Calvinism. So it's very important, if you're going to understand his life, you have some understanding of Calvinism. So in one sense, Luther was more interested in the need for the soul to be saved, but Calvin was about how do we bring about the rule of Christ in the world. The second thing you want to have some background understanding to as you think about Abraham Kuyper is the French Revolution and what it stood for. If you remember the three principles of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, the revolution represented in Europe a new way of living, a new way of thinking. It was fundamentally secular. And Kuyper spent his life fighting theological liberalism in the church because he saw that the Enlightenment had made people believe that they can live their lives without having life ordered according to God's law. And finally, it's good to also remember that there were lots of changes going on in Europe and in the Netherlands in the 19th century when Kuyper was born. And there was a new constitution in the Netherlands in 1848. Largely modeled on the British Constitution, and it was giving more power to Parliament and to political parties. It is into this context that we see Kuyper emerging as a political leader, as a Christian thinker. And Kuyper's own life led to what they call the pillarization of Dutch society, where the Catholics could have their own schools, their own newspapers, their own church, and the Reformed Christians in the Netherlands could have their own schools and their political parties and their newspapers. So society was pillarized. The Dutch word is verzuiling. And so unless you understand some of this background, it's going to be difficult to get an understanding of his life. So Abraham Kuyper was born on the 29th of October 1837, and he died on the 8th of November in 1920. He was 83 years old when he died. He lived to a ripe old age. He was born in the town of Maasluis near Rotterdam, and his father was Jan Frederik Kuyper, who served as a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. Kuyper was born as a baby with a huge head, and his parents actually thought he might have hydrocephalus, which is water in the head. If you look at cartoons of Kuyper, and many cartoons were made about Kuyper, he always had a big head. Most of his schooling was at home. He had home education. He was a gifted pupil and an avid reader. In fact, he had a real gift for languages, and when he finally did go to school, and he was graduating from school, he gave his valedictory address in German. That's how clever little Abraham Kuyper was. He enrolled as a student to study theology at Leiden University in the summer of 1855, and within 7 years received his doctorate, comparing the doctrine of the church, the ecclesiology in the theology of John Calvin, and a Polish reformer named John Lasko. That's how you say it. It's an anglicized way of saying a Polish name. What is interesting, I need to stop and say something here. Kuyper at this point had increasingly become a liberal. He had some kind of faith growing up in a Christian home. His father himself was a liberal minister, but by the time he got to Leiden, he had openly embraced liberal theology. One of his professors there told him about an essay competition and suggested that Kuyper should take part in the competition, and suggested that he looks at this Polish reformer, John Lasko, was a liberal reformer. It so happened that there was no availability anywhere in the Netherlands, any of the writings of this Polish reformer, Lasko. But the professor said, maybe you want to visit my father, and he might possibly have some of his writings. And when Kuyper gets to this professor's father's house, he finds that the only copy in the Netherlands of Lasko's writings were available. And he, of course, takes part in this competition and wins the gold medal. And that competition that he wins the gold medal in becomes the basis from which he wrote his doctorate thesis. And when Kuyper wrote his doctorate thesis, he had somewhat of a disdain for Calvin. In fact, there is a story told about Kuyper attending a lecture at the university, and one of the lecturers gave a lecture denying the bodily resurrection of Jesus. At the end of the lecture, Kuyper along with his fellow students stood up and wildly applauded the lecturer when he had made this public denial of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So this was Kuyper as he becomes, he graduates with a doctorate, very gifted, very intellectual, and he goes into becoming a pastor. And we don't fully know what the reasons were. It might have been financial reasons, because he could have easily become a professor and gone into academic life, but he decides he wants to become a pastor. And something happens at this point in Kuyper's life. His fiancée at that time, Johanna Henrika Schaje, gives him a book, and the title of the book is The Heir of Redcliffe, and it was published by a woman named Charlotte Young. Young was an English novelist who wrote her novels for the service of the church, and her book helped spread the Oxford movement. The book tells the story about a particular man named Philip Morville, who was a conceited hypocrite who enjoys unwarranted high reputation. And somehow this book impacts Kuyper's heart in a profound way. This is what Kuyper says: "That masterpiece was for me a means towards the breaking of my self-satisfied, contentious heart." He wrote in a letter to Joanna, and I'm going to read what he wrote. "The heir of Redcliffe has done me good. I cried as a child and knelt to pray out of remorse. Things were not good with me. I had been too self-satisfied, too desirous of honor, too egoistic, not noble enough, not enough of a child of God. For years I had deceived myself and convinced myself that I was doing good. My conscience, my childlike heart lulled to sleep. I did not know what sin was anymore, and I knew no contrition. I was alone in my room, and I went upstairs and I knelt on my knees and prayed long and fervently. I had not prayed like this for years." So this was a very important moment in Kuyper's life. In fact, later on he would say that after the Bible, this book was hugely significant, and in fact reading this book and what happened to his heart made him move away from liberal theology towards the classical Christian roots, particularly Calvinism. He marries Johanna in 1863, and he goes to his first parish in 1863, the same year he was married, to a little town in Beesd, B-E-E-S-D, where he encountered ordinary village people who saw the world very differently from Kuyper. Kuyper has come with a doctorate from Leiden University, one of the most prestigious universities in the country, with all the liberal theology that he had been educated in. And there is an incident there that is important to remember. He finds out that there is a bit of discontent in the church. And there were some folks that were not wanting to come to his church anymore because they didn't like Kuyper's preaching. Some of them felt like he was not preaching, his messages were no longer providing the bread of life. So Kuyper decides to go and visit one of these women who was leading somewhat of a rebellion against Kuyper's authority. Her name was Pitia Baltus, a daughter of a poor laborer. And the more he began to speak to her, he found out that while he had all the knowledge and the doctrine, these people had a genuine faith. There was something of deep conviction about God and Christ in their lives. And over time, Kuyper goes through what he considers a second conversion, emerging more fully into the Orthodox Calvinist understanding of the world and understanding of Scripture. And this is where when he was a pastor there, that he makes a commitment to lead a fight against liberalism, because he saw in these folks a genuine faith that really challenged him. Throughout his life, he kept a photo of Pitia Baltus on his desk. Wherever he was, even when he was prime minister, he had a photo of this woman on his desk because of the impact the people at this church had made. So he then moves from this small church to a bigger church in Domkerk in Utrecht in 1867, and he was there until 1870. And he became embroiled in theological controversies with the liberal wing of the Dutch Reformed Church. And over time, he starts his own denomination, the Reformed Church of the Netherlands. In 1872, Kuyper founded and became the chief editor of the newspaper The Standard, incorporating within itself a religious weekly called De Herut, which of course Kuyper himself was writing. And in his lifetime of a 50-year period, Kuyper wrote over 1,000 articles on political, cultural, and educational issues. In fact, the newspaper became the machinery to propagate Kuyper's ideas, particularly the call to a more biblical Christianity. You need to live until you are in your 80s to be able to read everything that Kuyper has written. In fact, a lot of his writings are still not available in English, and there's more of an effort right now to publish his writings in English. On March 20th, 1874, Kuyper, at the age of 36, won a recent parliamentary election and took the required oath of office and assumed a seat in the second chamber in The Hague and became a member of the Dutch Parliament. And Kuyper's journey from being a minister in the church to becoming a politician was fundamentally about living out his Christian calling. For him, the idea that he would give up being a pastor to become a politician was not a contradiction. It was not a discontinuity for him. It was a continuity with what he saw himself called to do by God. He saw being in politics as a means for promoting the reformation of society according to Christian principles. And here something happens that it would be good to stop and think about in terms of formative influence on this social reformer. Kuyper is invited to England to attend an American revival meeting, and it was connected with people like D.L. Moody, and in particular the name Robert Herschel Smith comes up. And Kuyper brings a delegation from the Netherlands to attend this revival meeting. It's the higher life or the holiness movement. And Kuyper was so impacted. This is what he writes about his experience. He called it his Bethel experience. Bethel, of course, the place where Jacob encountered God. Guilt and sin were never so deeply felt as there in the wonderful presence of the Lord. Hardly a single harsh word can be heard during those days amongst those thousands of people. There were about 8,000 people there. Differences melted away. There was love for one another. God's power revealed itself not only around us, but in and through the soul. On the final day before the Dutch delegation was to leave, they were asked to describe what their experience of was attending this revival meeting, and this is what he said: "My cup runneth over." Kuyper goes back and he begins to write in his Sunday supplement of the Standard his experience about this revival meetings that he attended in Brighton. Unfortunately, a few weeks before he could complete the series of articles he was writing, some of them titled "The Stealing of the Elect," "Reformed Fasting," he had an emotional and mental breakdown. And part of that was because he was overworked. But also it was because of how he came to experience this sort of effort to become holy. But also he found out later that the American evangelist Robert Purcell Smith was having adulterous affairs with women at the revival meetings. And his wife had been party to his behavior. And that really affected Kuyper hugely, what had happened, because he had started a personal correspondence with Smith. And so Kuyper goes on to then later critique this kind of pietism, because he saw in this revival pietism an unwillingness to engage with the world and engage with what is going on in society. When he went to America to give his stone lectures, he was public about what he described as the tendencies of Methodism to turn into pietistic and subjective behavior. So this experience that he has with American revivalism was on one hand important, because if you read his devotional writings, which he did even when he was prime minister, there was always his effort to be right with God. But he also saw problems with pietistic Christianity. In 1879, he founded the Anti-Revolutionary Party, anti-revolutionary of course referring to the French Revolution. It was largely due to his effort that it was the first popular political party in the Netherlands. As I said before, it was a party to represent the wishes of ordinary folks, and also he used his time in Parliament to get state funding for religious schools. He believed that Dutch citizens were already paying taxes, and they shouldn't be using money after they have paid taxes to fund schools. The state should equally fund all schools, and that is his big contribution in terms of getting the church to affirm that different orthodoxies can be affirmed in different schools, and the state should not discriminate against any particular religious group. So the Catholics could be funded for their Catholic schools. In 1880, of course, he founded the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, the Free University of Amsterdam, a university that he believed was free from the control of the state and free from the control of the church. In his inaugural lecture, of course, this is what he said, which I earlier quoted. "Oh, no single piece of our mental world is to be hermeneutically sealed off from the rest. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine." And this university that is founded is still there in Amsterdam today, and it has hugely contributed to national life. And it was founded by Abraham Kuyper, who believed the university should not be dominated by the state. It was a sphere independent of the sphere of the state. In 1988, he traveled to the USA to deliver the prestigious Stone Lectures at Princeton Theological Seminary. And he also traveled around America, speaking in New York, Philadelphia, Grand Rapids, places that had large Dutch immigrant population. He also met with President William McKinley at the White House in Washington. Let me say a few things about this lecture that he gave, which is in Peter Heslam's book, his lectures on Calvinism. Calvinism, Kuyper believed to be the only decisive, lawful, consistent defense for Protestant nations against the encroaching and overwhelming modernism. And modernism was the idea that came out of the French Revolution. He sought to present Calvinism as an all-embracing life system or a worldview, Weltanschauung, stressing the relationship between God, humans, and the world. In fact, Kuyper is the first one who began to talk about the creation, fall, redemption framework. And in his lectures, he talked about Calvinism and history, Calvinism and religion, Calvinism and politics, but he included lectures on Calvinism and science, Calvinism and the arts. For Kuyper, beauty was important. In 1901, Kuyper finally becomes the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. And for him, becoming Prime Minister was about bringing Christian principles to bear on public life concerning citizens, families, employers, employees, marriage, schools. He believed that government could contribute to the when government is properly functioning according to God's will, it allows these other spheres of society to flourish in their own terms. He felt that a democratic society, it was appropriate for believers to organize on the basis of Christian principles with a common agenda to protect society from influences from modernism. But Kuyper was theologically conservative after he had this experience at the church he was at in Beeds. But he was culturally progressive, and what I mean by that is he wanted to respect the rights of secular parties in the Netherlands to promote their own agenda. This is the whole idea of the pillarization. Groups were given freedom in civil society to pursue what they believed was right. And so he was not a Christian fundamentalist in some sense, in which you want to sort of defeat and destroy your opponents. And in 1909, he came under heavy criticism for something called the Decorations Affair, when it was alleged that Kuyper had received money from a guy named Rudolf Lehmann to make him an officer of the Orange Order, or the Order of Orange Nassau. And a parliament debate was held, and an inquiry was set forth, and Kuyper, of course, was innocent, was reported to be innocent. And we begin to see, as he gets later in life, his influence recedes into the background, and he died on the 8th of November 1920 with his family gathered around him, and a friend by the name of Eytan, who he wanted by his deathbed. And this is what Kuyper had written before he died. "Every earthly triumph is but a poor image of the all-exceeding triumph of the one who enters the gates of the New Jerusalem." And his friend who was there read this verse from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. "For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made by human hands. Eternity is our home." So that was Kuyper's life in broad strokes of what he had achieved. It has not been possible for me in this lecture to include parts of Kuyper's thinking on poverty. He had a lot to say about poverty and how to deal with poverty and welfare. He had also traveled around North Africa, and he had written some travelogue on Islam, and that's another area of thinking that we can look at in terms of what Kuyper thought about in terms of Islam. And of course, Indonesia was a colony of the Netherlands. And finally, there is more research being done into the connection between Kuyper's thinking and apartheid in South Africa, which sort of tried to work out a parallel system for different groups. And so some people think Kuyper is directly responsible. I don't agree with that. But Kuyper's thinking was used by the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa to justify apartheid. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about some of his key ideas, and then I will conclude. One of the key ideas that Kuyper put forth was this idea of antithesis. Kuyper believed there is a fundamental inconsumate separation between what would be true and what would be false. The two you cannot reconcile the two. So this idea that if there were liberal ideas about the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and there were what he would call biblical ideas, you cannot make the two sort of somehow syncretize them. He emphasized, he made a strong point to make sure that people understood that truth has to be divided from what is false. That was his first key idea, this antithesis. While at the same time, Kuyper affirmed common grace. Common grace is the idea that God has revealed a particular grace, special grace in Jesus Christ, and those who know him have come to have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, but everyone experiences common grace. So when you have a scientist that is not a Christian doing research into some medical technology and they discover something, for Kuyper that would be common grace. And so he believed God has given common grace for the preservation of creation, because without common grace, sin would completely destroy his creation. And so Kuyper was somehow able to both uphold the idea of the antithesis between light and darkness and affirm common grace, which is why he could see there was a place in his view of society for people who didn't believe in Christ. I think that's hugely important. The third thing that is, I think, key idea for Kuyper that we can take with us as we try to engage Kuyper's thinking is the lordship of Christ over all. Of course, Jesus is Lord over the life of the believer. Jesus is Lord over the church, but Kuyper strongly believed that Jesus was Lord over the whole of his creation. It was not that the world was somehow under a different lordship, and he challenged Christians to have a vision of what would the world look like if we really took seriously the idea that Christ is Lord of the world. Along with this idea of the lordship of Christ over all, the fourth idea that I think Kuyper would be known for is sphere sovereignty. Now, of course, we think of sovereignty in terms of the sovereignty of the state, but this is where Kuyper believed that the state is not the only body that's sovereign. He believed in terms of the family, the father has authority and is sovereign over the sphere of his family. In terms of the church, the leaders in the church have sovereignty in the church. And in terms of business, it is business people that should be sovereign in that sphere. And each sphere in society exists directly in relation to the face of God. God relates to these spheres independent of each other. Now, you've got to work out what this means in a complicated 21st century world. But in Dutch society in the 19th century, early 20th century, Kuyper believed that this was the way God wanted to organize society, which fundamentally challenged the centralization of power with the state. This led, of course, the idea of sphere sovereignty led to what he called principled pluralism, that society should not have one dominant confession. It allows for multiple confessions in terms of ultimate allegiance. And so this was principled pluralism. And finally, Kuyper has also been influential in the idea of Christian democracy, that the idea that Christians should not try to grab power and try to rule autocratically, but we believe that Christianity has got a unique relationship with democracy, and it affirms the exercise of power accountable to the law. So these are some of the key ideas of Abraham Kuyper, and we have to work out how we take these ideas and apply it today. So let me conclude my lecture on the life and legacy of Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper was certainly one of the most significant Christian leaders in the modern period. He was called the man with 10 heads and 100 arms. He was fearless, had an iron will, and a bulldog-like attitude to do God's work. He was not always a nice person to his adversaries and was hated by many for his accomplishments. Yet God raised this man and used him to change the world. Ultimately, of course, it is not about Abraham Kuyper, but about the God he served. Let me end my lecture with two quotes. On the 25th anniversary of the editorship of the paper that he founded, The Standard, in 1897, Kuyper declared, "One desire has been the ruling passion of my life. One high motive has acted like a spur upon my mind and soul. It is this, that in spite of all worldly opposition, God's holy ordinances shall be established again in the home, in the school, in the state, for the good of all people. To carve, as it were, into the conscience of the nation the ordinances of the Lord, to which the Bible and creation bears witness, until the nation again pays homage to God." And one other quote. "It is time we broaden our spiritual horizon and recognize that Jesus as King has sovereignty over the totality of human culture. Once that is realized, it becomes inevitable that both our spiritual development unto eternal life and our general cultural development that has led to such amazing increases in our knowledge and control over nature are placed under Christ's rule." Thank you very much.